This is video 2 of week 5. So let's just recap. What was the rationale for the hypothesis of a critical period for the acquisition of language? Two observations. The first one is that children are generally more successful than adults or older learners in learning a second language. So age determines or is correlated with learning outcome. And the second observation was that children can recover language, their first language, better than adults in case of loss by accident or by illness. Okay, so those are the two observations. And on the basis of that, it was postulated that there might be a critical period for language acquisition, the same way that there are critical periods for other developmental milestones that we know. Yeah, so that is the hypothesis, and that is the evidence that we have. Now, the first caveat that I would like to point out is that, as we have seen before, correlation is not causation. So that young children acquire a second language or even recover from a first language more easily might be due to factors other than their age, other than their neurological age, that is. While low age is correlated with high achievement, so they do better when they are younger, but that does not mean that it is their age that is responsible for this result. Okay, so correlation, when two things correlate, it does not mean that by themselves, other things being equal, one determines another in a causal relationship. Okay, so age alone might not necessarily cause learning outcome. Okay, so that hasn't been proven. I don't say here that it might not be the case. I just say that there is nothing that proves that correlation is also a relation of causation. And do click in that link about the storks and the babies if you want to just enjoy a little bit of humor or even the cultural reference of that meme that I put here. Correlation is not causation. Okay, so what additionally there are other challenges to these hypotheses, and is that language is taken as a whole again. But the multidimensionality of language is a challenge to the need to specify exactly what is being affected by the putative critical period. So when we say that age affects language acquisition, we have a problem here because, as I have insisted several times, we don't agree on the definition of language. So what do we mean? Is a specific part of language, of the grammar or of language functioning that we are talking about? Is it the whole of language or what? So it's hardly ever that scholars that postulate a critical period also give a definition of what they understand for language. Language is taken as a whole, and we know that is a little bit of a problem. Now, there's also the issue that for first language, the acquisition of first language, we can never have definite evidence of these hypotheses, and this is the forbidden experiment challenge that I will talk to you in a moment. Okay, so for second languages, maybe we could have evidence. It is a challenge because there is so much variability, but we could have evidence of for testing the second language acquisition. But as for there, neither one nor the other, we have specific, or we have clear scientific data for either one of those. So that is the conclusion, and I just summarize it here in one slide. So let's just start by addressing the question of how could we collect evidence for challenging or for proving these hypotheses. The evidence comes from three possibilities. The first one is what we call the forbidden experiment. The second one comes from special cases, and the third one comes from studies on immigrants and other L2 learners. And I'm going to give you here just a little bit of a flavor of what these situations are. So the first one is the forbidden experiment. What is the forbidden experiment? Is the following. So take a bunch of babies, isolate them from all linguistic stimuli until puberty. So put them in some chamber in which they have no interaction that belongs to language, that can be even loosely associated with language. So they have nobody talking to them, but they have nobody talking around them. They have also, if you remember, so that they don't identify anything by just the shape of the mouth or anything. So they have really no visual or auditory or any kind of stimuli that is related to language. So really take a bunch of babies and put them in boxes, for that matters, right? And that you need to keep them there. You feed them by tubes or by dropping some food and water and so forth, but you keep them in those boxes until puberty, until they are, to be safe, because puberty varies. So to be safe, let's just keep them there until they are 15 or 16 years of age. Now, when they're 16 years of age, you take them out of their isolation boxes, and then you expose them to linguistic stimuli, uh, complete linguistic stimuli that they would have been exposed to as babies otherwise. Actually, you should have a control group of babies in which they develop in normal circumstances. And then see whether these babies that have been isolated from all linguistic stimuli, whether they still develop normal language, like babies that are exposed to such stimuli since they were born, right? So if they do develop normal language, then there is no critical period for first language acquisition. These babies, the isolation babies, they just develop it later, but they develop it as well as the other babies. So no such thing as critical period, at least associated with puberty. You might think that there are other periods, other landmarks of development. So you might want to repeat the experiment with, keeping them until, I don't know, they're 20, and then until they're 30, and then, so on and so forth, right? And see if they keep developing after that isolation period, they keep developing language. Now, if they do not develop language after puberty, then it might be that puberty is a critical period for the development of language. Okay, so obviously, how does this sound to you? It sounds atrocious. You cannot keep human beings in those conditions for 15 years, not even for 15 minutes. You should keep them babies isolated in that way. That's why this is called the forbidden experiment, because it is morally forbidden. If you ask me, I think you should not do it with non-human animals either. But people, unfortunately, have done that to birds, as you will see in the documentary. But it is called the forbidden experiment for a reason. So evidence, even though that would be the best evidence that you can collect, evidence will not come this way. Now, the second way in which you can collect evidence for your critical period hypothesis is through unfortunate special cases in which you had no agency as a researcher directly, but facts of life, and brought some individuals to something similar to the isolation experiment, the forbidden experiment. So people recovering from aphasia, for example, would be the first ones in which they had language and they lost it. So there's almost like an erasement of everything linguistic in their brains, see if they recover. And then here, remember, Lernerberg, that was the point of departure of Lernerberg's cases, people who had lost language, whether they recover or not, and that's where the puberty landmark comes from. Also, late sign language acquisition of deaf children. So unfortunately, deaf children are not always detected early, so they might go it might go by several years before they even encounter some kind of language, normally sign language, and sometimes they are socialized into vocal language even. So it might be that children might not develop language normally, and there they might actually not develop language at all. These poor deaf kids. And then you can see whether if one reaches puberty in those conditions, and then you expose that kid to language, whether they develop language normally. Uh, the evidence seems to be that they don't necessarily, but it's just so complicated because we know so little about it. Yeah. Now, then you have people who have been victim of abuse in the form of neglect and even worse. And in the documentaries, you will see the cases of Victor or Jeannie, Oksana, and so on and so forth. And those are people who have been abandoned as babies, um, and have been found alive later on. But of course, the circumstances of abandonment came not only with them not being exposed to language, they came with them not having received any kind of emotional support or nourishment or nurture or any kind of support. So then it's hard to separate what results what of the outcomes that they end up having cognitively and emotionally and so forth, what is due to them having been deprived of language, or them having been deprived of any kind of human interaction and early life. So those are cases of abuse. So it's no wonder that in cases of abuse, you have that result. So, and that's going to be my conclusion. So it's not surprising that language acquisition under these altered conditions takes a different course from normal conditions, but it's questionable to attribute the difference to the nature of the learner's brain. They're so complex that these cases are so complex in the factors that brought them to have these experiences, that to think that it's to isolate language development is very questionable. So these cases end up being not all that useful for this particular topic. Now, you can also recur to neuroimaging and, for example, see whether people who develop language, the first language, timely, and where in the brain their language is located, and then compare those to people who develop a second language or a third or a fifth, right, language, and then to compare them and see whether that additional language is stored in a different center in the brain, which might indicate that the brain acquires and stores that second language in completely different fashion and in completely different geographical place in the brain as the first one, right? But here, just as we'll look at these neuroimaging studies a little more, but here as for a first approximation to what the conclusion is right now, is that we find no evidence to support the hypothesis that a language learned later in life is represented differently from the native language. So that seems to be pretty much the conclusion of the latest here. This one is not very late, but the latest studies that we have in this respect. Now, the third possible source of evidence for testing our hypothesis would come more from not so much the first language acquisition as the additional language acquisition. And one natural context in which one learns a new language is in the context of immigration, when you go to another country or another society or whatever, and then you are forced and want to learn the language of that new place. So you already have your language, and then you go and learn another one. So what happens then? Well, what happens then is that there is huge variability. So children generally acquire the new language very well. And as for adults, some adults learn foreign languages perfectly well. The language structures are already there from the first language, right? So they're linguistic beings already. So subsequent language learning is possible at any age. There is no clear point of no return. We have cases of people who have migrated quite late in life, in their 30s or later, and then they develop perfect language acquisition of the new language. They might even forget their other language, so they become monolingual in the new language, and then they have perfect development. So there is no evidence there either, as for that can be used for a hypothesis to confirm, to validate the hypothesis of a critical period for the acquisition of second languages either. So I'm presenting all of these possibilities because those are cases or situations that have been used in the discussion of whether there is a critical period or not for language. Okay, so if you look at the studies, you will encounter them, and then I want you to think about them from this little bit of skeptical or not convinced point of view. Okay. So I'm going to leave this video here, and then I'm going to see you in the next video.